So chapter 7 of Majulo has leaked, and if you thought Yuji being shown in chapter 6 was crazy, well, I got news for you. Because sure, in chapter 7, the old man sorcerer, while battling against the awoken Maru, realized that he hadn't been this scared in combat since he had to fight against Yuji Itadori, and I'm assuming his younger years. In chapter 7, we see Mahito, and it's not in some kind of flashback of an antagonist remembering a time when he was stronger, fighting even stronger opponents. No, it's just Mahito, possibly existing in some kind of extra-dimensional plane, waiting for Yuji's soul to pass so maybe they can fight each other in the afterlife, or something like that. See, because a promise was made from Yuji to Mahito that every single time Mahito reincarnated, Yuji would be there to stomp him out all over again. And it looks like that promise is still holding firm. Not to mention in this chapter, we got a reveal of this generation's cursed speech user, and oh yeah, one of the main characters is dying from a brain tumor. So when I tell you that chapter 7 in Majulo is not only the most action-packed chapter we've ever gotten, but also probably the best chapter we've ever gotten, I don't think I'm lying to you. With all that being said, there is a lot to get into, so with no further ado, let's head directly into chapter 7 of Majulo Explained. But before we get to explaining anything, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And if you're looking for one additional Nick video every single week, you guys can go ahead and find my Naruto reaction series using the fourth wall link in my description below. We're on to the one-on-one fights, and 1010 is getting unpaid for chiropractic lessons. But before we get into all that, today we gotta talk about our favorite recurring sponsor to the page, Factor. Listen, if you want to keep 11 dogs alive, float 4 YouTube channels, and build a house all simultaneously, unfortunately wondering about, what am I going to get from the grocery store to cook for lunch is not a part of your vernacular. And while my life might be a little bit more hectic than yours, I'm sure plenty of you have dreaded the idea of going to the grocery store, figuring out what you want to cook, getting the ingredients, cooking it, all so you can sit down and eat lunch that takes you hours. See, because there's never been a better time to get into Factor than right now, as they recently just doubled their weekly menu, offering their customers 80+ revolving meals to choose from every single week. And within the confines of those 80+ meals every single week, they've also doubled the amount of seafood offerings, now ensuring that more seafood than ever, like shrimp, salmon, and barramundi, is all available in the base plan of Factor at no additional cost. They've also committed themselves to covering basically any kind of dietary needs that anybody who would want to get into Factor would have, be that calorie conscious, high protein, no refined sugars, or vegetarian. But even if you're just picky, they've introduced something known as Protein Swap. Hate chicken but love pork? Cool, that meal that you wanted that has chicken can now have pork. But Nick, Factor's meals, they're a bit too American for me. Well, no longer, as they've also expanded their global cuisine with the launch of new Asian and Mediterranean meals, offering 30+ options. But there's a big difference between telling and showing, so let's head down to the kitchen and crack into some Factor.
Throw it in the microwave for the big 100 and, oh god, it's gotta be on the spinning part. 120 seconds. Remove the film and dig in. We're gonna get a little bit of the cavatappi, a little bit of the chicken, a little bit of the broccoli, and enjoy creamy, savory sauce over perfectly cooked noodles. That is great.
So what are you waiting for? Head to factor75.com or click the link below and use code TWCFB50 to get 50% off your first Factor box and free breakfast for a year. That's code TWCFB50 at factor75.com to get 50% off plus free breakfast for 1 year. Offer only valid with new Factor subscription, customers with code, and qualifying auto-renewing subscription. Take back your day with Factor. So chapter 7 does not start where chapter 6 left off. For those of you who don't remember, get your brains checked, it was a week ago. But chapter 6 ended with Cross jumping into the battle between Maru and Tsurugi and calming down or knocking out or deactivating the power of Maru, who was trying to finish off the old man sewing needle sorcerer. Now the reason that Cross stepped in is because Tsurugi made a plea out to the unconscious Maru that the two of them were supposed to be neighbors. Now this hit Maru apparently in the small sliver of soul he has left, because Cross stepped into the battle and upon placing his hand on Maru's forehead, he was able to sedate him, ending the battle. However, chapter 7 does not pick up from this moment, because apparently while Tsurugi was trying to ensure that Maru didn't cross the line and kill this evil old man sorcerer, that very same evil old man sorcerer made a little dash. Well, however, he wasn't able to get too far as the chapter opens, seemingly with the old man being cornered by Usama. And while the old man thinks about how he's got a window of time to escape, while the demon, Maru, battles it out with the sorcerer, Tsurugi, from the end of the alleyway that the old man is standing in, Usami yells out, "Don't move." However, the old man, who's still incredibly powerful, turns to Usami and says, "Who are you to tell me that? My teacher?" As he enters a defensive stance with his sewing needle sword. But it's at this point that Usami begins to remove the glove on his left hand. And on the second page, we see Usami place his hand over his mouth. And upon placing his hand over his mouth, we see that on his hand is a tattoo-like seal. A tattoo-like seal that when placed over his mouth makes his face seem as though that has the same tattoos as somebody like Inumaki. And thus Usami says, once again, when the hand moves over his face, "Don't move." And in that moment, the old man is frozen as he thinks to himself, the serpent and fang curse seal. It's curse speech. But before he's able to clock what's going on here or break out of the control of the curse speech that Usami is using, Usami lands a furious right hook on his chin and knocks him clean out. Now, this is interesting. Outside of the fact that Usami looks sick here, and the concept of the curse seal for curse speech being on your hand and you having to cover your mouth in order to use it is also incredible. This version of cursed speech is undoubtedly weaker than the kind that Inumaki used. See, because cursed energy and cursed techniques are basically based off the Nen power system, it's identified that the more risks you take in the cursed techniques that you pull off, the stronger your cursed techniques. And therefore, if you're a cursed speech user whose curse seal is on their mouth, limiting to the things that you're allowed to say to onigiri ingredients, then you are constantly taking the risk of using your cursed speech against people you don't want to. And therefore, because of the inconvenience and the risk, Inumaki's curse speech is undoubtedly stronger than that of Usami's, who's allowed to not only talk and conversate however he wants, but is also very clearly able to use curse speech just by removing a glove and putting his hand over his mouth. Now, there is technically some disadvantage here, because one of Usami's hands has to be tied up to use his technique, but that's really not all that inconvenient. But still, a really sick scene. Now, immediately after hitting him with a right hook, Usami flies in and kicks him square in the face. And after knocking him out and re-donning his glove, he tells Mino to take care of the rest, and Mino just also happens to be there. Now, this gives us a pretty good idea of how strong Usami is. I mean, yes, this old man sorcerer obviously wasn't at the peak of his strength. He didn't have access to his maternal guardian spirit. He had just been knocked out clean by Maru. But still, the fact that Usami was able to two-piece him is kind of impressive. And makes sense on account of the fact that Usami probably should be more powerful than either Yuka or Tsurugi. Now, after the old man is done and dealt with, back to Cross, Maru, and Tsurugi. As Cross has Tsurugi by the collar of his shirt, screaming in his face, asking him, "What was that just now?" Now, Tsurugi gets cross with Cross as he slyly replies, "Oh, am I allowed to talk to you now?" But Cross keeps pushing as he holds Tsurugi and says, "Enough of that. What did you mean by neighbor? You're the one who said it, right?" Now, obviously, this is in reference to Tsurugi's desperate plea to the unconscious Maru to wake up and stop attacking him because the two of them were supposed to be neighbors. Now, in reply to this line of questioning, Tsurugi's barely able to cough out, "Friends. I wanted us to be friends who understood what was important to each other." And this pisses Cross off as he says, "Stop talking about these unnecessary dreams. You and me could never be neighbors. See, I know the history of this country. After the war, and I'm assuming the war here is in reference to the Culling Games, you humans enjoyed peace on Earth. A peace that was laid out by the great powers that were. What can you possibly understand about that? Humans don't need to constantly think about protecting their own lives. Everything necessary for becoming a human is born with you the second you're thrust into this world. You actually probably looked down on refugees as dirty, poor, and dangerous, especially after establishing your superiority in the international community following the Kyoto Paranormal Summit. Ever since that moment, Japan's been particularly cruel." Now, there's a lot to break down in this rant. The first kind of big takeaway we can get from Cross screaming all of this at Tsurugi is that for some reason, Cross is acutely aware of the history of the world. Now, it's not crazy to assume that the Sumerians did some research on the Earth before they decided to pull up their entire mothership to the Earth and try to live amongst the humans. I mean, you obviously would want to know a lot about the planet you were trying to live on, and probably even more about the country you were trying to live in. However, this rant right here, and kind of the rest of the chapter, sets up Cross to be a character who's been burned by humans kind of his whole life. Like there's been some kind of Sumerian-human interaction that occurred long before the beginning of Majula. Like humans have been somehow, some way, suppressing the Sumerians for a long time. And that's where seemingly a lot of the animosity that made this rant happen in the first place is coming from. On top of this, Cross talking about the Kyoto Paranormal Summit or whatever it was, it's important here because in the very, very beginning of Majula, if you remember correctly, it was established that even though Japan was identified as the country that would deal with basically all things paranormal, post the Culling Games, Japan became very, very isolationist. A real-life reflection of what's happening in Japan right now, like in the real world, like here, us, you, me. And therefore the idea of Japan taking in refugees in the Sumerians is supposed to be a relatively relatively thinly veiled reference to Japan's isolationist and relatively xenophobic nature in the real world. And therefore, Cross, who's yelling at a Japanese citizen in Tsurugi who technically works for the government, is saying that you probably believe that all refugees are dirty, dangerous animals. And as Cross is technically one of those refugees, that's where at least a little bit of this animosity is coming from. Now, we never get Tsurugi's counterpoints here, because he's unconscious while all this is being screamed at him, and therefore when the rant is done, the next thing that we see is Cross and Usami talking in the hospital, where Cross is asking Usami if it's okay that he takes Maru back to the mothership so that Maru can get specialized treatment. Now, Usami immediately sees through this, as Cross is just trying to bring Maru back to the mothership so that he can show all the other Sumerians Maru in an injured state and be like, look how bad the humans are. So Usami kind of shuts it down and says, unless there's some kind of Sumerian-based treatment that he needs, we'll do the best that we can down here. But Cross still walks over towards Maru. And thus Usami is afraid that even though he denied his request to take Maru back to the mothership, Cross was going to get some kind of biological sample from Maru that would be able to prove to all the other Sumerians that Maru was injured and possibly even held captive down on Earth. However, instead of doing that, Cross actually just walks over to Maru, takes the band-aid off his third eye and covers his own, and takes Maru's hair tie and ties up his hair with it, taking on the appearance of Maru. Except, of course, the markings on his cheek. Maru's markings on his cheek curl, while Cross's are straight. Anyways, we then cut to Tsurugi, suddenly jolting out of bed in the hospital. And the reason that Tsurugi is jolting out of bed is because he was having some kind of terrible dream. Because in that terrible dream, or possible trek into the afterlife, Tsurugi came face to face with a mysterious, upside-down, rather gaunt figure, with long, shabby hair, a wide smile, and his neck sewed to his head. Even though this character doesn't look exactly like the only character that fits that description, the only character that fits that description is Mahito. But what is Mahito doing in Majula? And why is he appearing to Tsurugi? Well, there's a lot of theories. Some believe that Mahito's soul has recirculated and he's remanifested on Earth. However, he remanifested after Yuji's death, and therefore, while he's been looking for Yuji to kill him in an act of revenge, he hasn't been able to find him, and therefore he's been looking for replacements, people who could possibly remind him of Yuji. There are also those who believe that a segment of Mahito's soul still exists in the passageway that allows for the circulation of souls, the very same passageway where Mahito met with Sukuna in the last chapter of JJK. Therefore, with Tsurugi being pushed to the boundary of death by the old man sorcerer and Maru, that as he dipped a toe into this passageway, he came face to face with Mahito, waiting for Yuji's soul, which would explain why he is gaunt and older and his hair is all shabby, because he's been waiting in this passageway for 68 years, which would imply that Yuji is still alive. Now, obviously, all of this is based off the fact that Yuji told Mahito that every single time he reincarnated, Yuji would stomp him out all over again. And all of these theories are bolstered by the fact that Yuji was literally mentioned in the last chapter. But there is so much of the idea that Mahito is being re-injected back into the story, and so many possibilities, that it honestly needs to be covered in a video of its own, and that will be the next video we upload on this channel, so hit the noti bell so you know when it's coming out. Anyways, Tsurugi jumps out of bed, because who wouldn't upon seeing Mahito's face, and a person who looks like Maru but is actually Cross asks very jovially, Tsurugi, are you okay? Now, Tsurugi immediately turns to Cross and asks him, where's Yuka? Because if you remember, in the battle against the old man sorcerer, Yuka got skewered like 6 times. Cross lets him know that she's under examination but completely fine. Cross, while still cosplaying Maru, then lets Tsurugi know that Cross apparently jumped into the battle and saved all of them. At which point Tsurugi asks Cross, is he always like that? To which Cross asks, well, what do you mean? To which Tsurugi responds to by saying, is he always that angry? And this kind of throws Cross off as he stutters out, well, it's not like that. There's a reason he's like that. As he tells Maru, Cross, as he says, Maru, I'm sorry. Back then when we talked about invasions and other people kicking down other people's doors and entering their homes, I didn't have enough imagination. To save my life, you used the curse technique, right? Will you face any consequences for that? To which Cross responds to, for now, no. Now it's this point that Yuka strolls in, apparently completely fine, saying it's the MVP. Now I don't know if this is in reference to her, Tsurugi, or Maru. Knowing Yuka, it's probably in reference to her. Now Cross, doing his best Maru impersonation, turns to Yuka and goes, Yuka! And I believe at this point Yuka and Tsurugi start talking about how impressive a fighter Maru is, saying that if he was a sorcerer, he'd easily be first class, or like grade 1, you know? And then a lot of them start talking about what they're gonna do today, at which point Tsurugi reveals that he can move, but he wants to know how Yuka's doing, because he doesn't believe that the wounds that were inflicted upon her would be enough to keep her down for long, which I guess is something you can really only say about somebody who's actively trying to be Yuta, because boy oh boy did she get stabbed like 6 6 times. And in response to this, Yuka says, yeah, no, I'm fine, I just wasn't feeling very well. Tsurugi then says, well, then shall we go? At which point Maru, Cross, asks to where? And it's revealed that the where is an amusement park. So Yuka, Tsurugi, Mino, and Cross all gallivant across an amusement park, riding merry-go-rounds, roller coasters, eating popcorn, and complain about how they want more speed from all of the rides that they're riding. However, Mino chips in and said, well, if all of the rides wanted to match your pace, everybody else but you guys would die. Now, to this point, that apparently Cross is getting sick of being Maru, because he's just eating popcorn by himself. However, that popcorn isn't keeping him busy enough to not catch the balloon of a child who had just accidentally let go of it. Now, Cross seemingly does this subconsciously, and he hands it back down to the child, who looks up at Cross with big childlike eyes and says, what about my mom? At which point, Cross, Tsurugi, and Yuka all realize that this child has lost his mother. Now, Yuka immediately flies into big sister territory as she pulls up next to the child and says, you're lost, aren't you? Well, my big brother, even though he may have a scary face, he'll take you to the child care center. However, before the child can be hawked off to Tsurugi and Mino both sprint off to the lost child center to go get help. Unless Yuka lets the child know that his mother will come to them if they just wait. Now the child immediately begins crying, and Cross, who like I've already established is pretty sick of being Maru at this point in time, looks at him like a Russian parent and says, why are you crying? Don't cry. It's not like your parents are dead or anything. Be quiet and stand tall. And this makes the situation substantially worse, so the child now believes that his parents could actually be dead. And thus Yuka scolds what she believes is Maru, calling him an idiot. Now in order to stop the child from crying, Cross decides to throw his popcorn in the air, bust out a massive backflip, and then catch his popcorn. And this draws the attention of not only the child, but an entire group of people. But Yuka sees this as competition and busts out a backflip of her own, which kind of ticks off Cross, mostly because seemingly her backflip wasn't as high as his. And on the next page, we see that they busted out backflips long enough for the lost child's mother to find her child. And the two of them thank Cross, and the child hands over the balloon to Cross. Now Yuka calls over to Tsurugi and says the lost child problem has been solved, and Cross begins to read the balloon, and the balloon says Happy Halloween. It's a jack-o'-lantern. Cross, upon reading this, says Halloween out loud, and Yuka begins to explain what Halloween is to Cross, explaining that it was originally a Christian festival, though she believes that it actually might have come from a different religion first, which is the actual lore on Halloween. Like, well, yes, the explanation you're gonna get about like how Halloween started is that in the 8th century, the Catholic Church designated November 1st to be All Saints Day, and therefore the evening before, October 31st, became All Hallows Eve. Halloween is actually based off an ancient Celtic festival, the Festival of Samhain. I don't know if that's how you say it. That's probably wrong. Which was hosted every single year to mark the end of summer and the end of the harvest season. However, apparently the Celts believed that the boundary between the living and the dead blurred on October 31st. Now, Maru, upon hearing that it was originally a Christian holiday, is Christ? Is that the religion of the Earthlings? Which I find interesting because it's kind of this moment where Cross doesn't seem to understand humanity. Probably won't say anything about Maru and Cross switching because Tsurugi really cares about his appearance, and if he's wrong, he'll think he'll make a fool out of himself. However, that's not implicitly stated. There's kind of apparently some lost sentences here in the fan translation, but based off the context of what I'm seeing here, I believe that's the conversation that's being had. However, after Yuka calls out Cross for cross-dressing as Maru, seeing through his disguise, she asks him if he knows what a fumi is. Apparently, a long time ago in Japan, Christianity was forbidden, and therefore in Kyoto, which is the Shinto capital of Japan, in order to find Christians, they would make people step on pictures of Christ. Those who couldn't do it were considered to be Christians and therefore executed. Yuka goes on to talk about how she believes that this was always kind of crazy. See, because if she were a Christian herself, she would just step on the picture, and later she would apologize to Jesus or God, because if you die, none of it matters anymore. She then goes on to talk about how culture and religion are easy to respect if you identify that somebody's is different than yours, but sometimes it can be hard to empathize with what they deem as important. And I find this to be a really cool tangent, because like, yeah, as an atheist, it's very easy to be like, okay, well, why did they just step on a photo of Christ? Christianity's all about forgiveness. Wouldn't Jesus just want you alive? And it's at this point that Cross asks a relatively profound counter question. When he asks Yuka, well, what if it was alive? What if you were being forced to walk on was alive? Could you walk on it then? If rather than an image of Christ, it was Christ himself, could you be told to step over him if you believed him to be the actual Son of God? Implying that Christians feel as though this image of what they believe to be the Son of God in Jesus Christ has an almost alive-like radiance, and therefore not until you're able to step into their worldview can you understand why they possibly wouldn't want to step on this picture. See, because of course it's the sentiment of the non-believers that you can simply throw away your religion and ask for forgiveness later. Those weren't the level of Christians that those in Kyoto were trying to root out. Anybody who would willingly step on a photo of Christ wasn't a true Christian that Shinto worshippers would need to be worried about. about. Now, Yuka admits that she'd never thought about it that way before, at which point Cross starts to cross-examine her, saying, so you finally understand. See, the way that you and your brother think is relatively shallow. Humans like you have trampled all over our lives without even thinking about it. Sometimes you just watch from the sidelines, and other times you play an active role in our demise. See, I don't believe that those who have been robbed have the right to steal themselves. However, those who have been robbed will always retain the right to take back what was originally theirs. Be prepared for that. Now, obviously, everything that was just said there is a relatively big statement. And see, because this is one of those moments I was talking about earlier in this chapter, Cross is very openly showing animosity for humankind, and that animosity is seemingly rooted in years of wrongdoings from humans to Sumerians, with Cross talking about how humans have either sat on the sidelines where they could have helped Sumerians, or apparently times when humanity has simply taken things away from Sumerians. But this would imply some kind of relationship between the Sumerians and humanity prior to this meeting that we saw at the beginning of this manga. Some kind of built-up animosity that has existed for years, if not decades. And I believe what we might be building towards is the reveal of how cursed energy was introduced to Earth. See, because isn't it interesting that the Sumerians look like humankind? Isn't it interesting that they share a power system through cursed energy? Isn't it interesting that out of the infinite habitable planets out in the universe, the Sumerians ended up at Earth? Isn't it interesting that Cross is constantly talking about how humanity stole something from the Sumerians? What if the Sumerians were the original inhabitants of Earth? But humankind, kind of like how Homo sapiens slowly but surely eradicated Neanderthals, began to push Sumerians out until eventually they were forced to leave the planet and find somewhere else to live. Only now coming back that humanity has completely forgot about their Sumerian past. It's a theory with more meat on its bone than you might realize, which is why we're gonna dedicate an entire video to it, so bonk the bell, baby. Anyways, this basically all-out declaration of war kind of throws Yuka into a spiral as she thinks to herself that he just casually declare war and then decides to ignore it. And thus Yuka redirects the conversation and says, well, actually this is perfect timing. How about you come hang out with me tomorrow? To which Cross reluctantly agrees to by asking where to. We then flash to the next day where we see Yuka and Cross inside of a hospital. And it appears as though Yuka is getting a diagnosis of a tumor inside of her brain. On the next page, we see Yuka and Cross crossing a river, and Yuka's talking about how she spaced out for the majority of the time the doctor was talking, and therefore she didn't even hear the name of the illness. But apparently Cross was paying attention, as she said, isn't it basically just cancer? I've heard that's relatively common amongst Earthlings. I guess the problem's in my brain. I thought it was just the headache. I guess I only have half a year left, huh? What a cheap drama today has been. There was no handsome man trying to bust in to save me from my diagnosis. Now, at this point, that Cross, who's maybe upset about not being called handsome, asks Yuka why she brought him along. And it's this point that Yuka gets incredibly vulnerable with Cross, saying that she didn't want to be alone. She's not looking for sympathy, but she had no one else to ask. And upon hearing that incredibly vulnerable moment from Yuka, Cross now tells Yuka about what crosses she has to bear. Fuck! We talked about Jesus and I didn't even make a cross joke then. What am I doing? Of course, a guy named Cross would have problems about a guy on a cross getting walked across. I mean, there's layers. What am I doing? I'm fading. Anyways, Cross begins to tell Yuka, let me tell you this. Even though your life expectancy is only 6 months, your heart has already died. No matter what you do, you'll never feel the same kind of wonder or emotion as you did before this diagnosis. The things that once made you laugh, your favorite meals, music, scenery, all of it will be bland. As you'll think, so what? What does it matter? I'm gonna die anyways. From there on, you'll spend the rest of your life throwing yourself into a vicious whirlpool of hatred. You'll keep thinking, why did this happen to me and not somebody else? Yuka, your future was stolen from you. So will you steal from those who have already been stolen from? Essentially bringing up the talking point from earlier, that Cross doesn't believe that those who have been stolen from have the right to rob other people. And therefore, Cross is essentially saying, hey Yuka, I'm sorry that you're gonna die soon, but just because you're gonna die soon doesn't mean you should necessarily sway humanity towards driving the Sumerians out. But Yuka, who's maybe curious or maybe just sick of Cross's animosity, begins to ask who I guess she still believes is Maru, so maybe she didn't see through his disguise. What happened to Cross? What will Cross do? And it seems to be loosely implied here, once again, these are all fan translations, that Yuka is essentially comparing her brain tumor diagnosis to the trauma that Cross is constantly talking about that was apparently inflicted by humanity. And this triggers Cross, who starts yelling at Yuka and says, don't lump us together. What we suffered was man-made. It was different from an illness or an accident. But Yuka defends herself by saying that while Cross lost his home, he's still alive. I am gonna die. Now, this line from Cross here, what we suffered was man-made, and therefore it's different from illness or an accident, kind of confirms this idea to me that there's been some long kind of underground battle between the Sumerians and humanity that maybe could tie all the way back to humanity's beginning. Even though Yuka is prodding at Cross to try and get him to tell her more about himself, Cross doesn't budge an inch as he looks at Yuka and he says, what, did you think winning a misery contest against me would get me to repent? But Yuka stops him and says, stop rushing to conclusions. We're just talking. There are things that I can't change, but you, Cross, so maybe she does know it's Cross. With time, you can change them, right? It's okay to be angry at unfairness. It's okay to not forget. So please, tell us everything. What happened to you, Cross? We're not your enemies. But Cross won't take this olive branch that's being reached out to it. As he screams at Yuka, that's just a nice sounding lie. Do you think I can be satisfied with reason and logic waved at me from the opposite shore? No, you're not even standing on the opposite shore anymore. You bastards, when you talk about coexistence, from now on, you mean live without being a burden to the rest of humanity. But how long? How long must we live in the shadows? We spent years in that miserable life and I won't stand for it anymore. I will take the life we deserve by force. But Yuka, probably calmed by the fact that she knows even if a war does kick off between the humans and the Sumerians, she won't be alive to see the end of it, asks Cross, how long will you keep on stealing? See, hating people is easy, and taking from people is easy too. So you'll just keep repeating it, won't you? Let's end that cycle with us. And with that, chapter 7 of Majulo ends. Now, obviously, there's an absurd amount to take away from this chapter. Mahito is maybe back. Cross is very actively pushing for a war between humans and Sumerians. Yuka has a deadly brain tumor that's only going to give her 6 months to live. I'm assuming Rika's going to do something to heal it, probably. I really can't see the story ending with Yuka dying of cancer. That'd be devastating. I'm assuming there's going to be some passing of the ring moment, and Rika's going to be able to use RCT to save Yuka's life. Maybe, who knows? Or maybe she'll have some kind of third eye awakening that awakens her to her Sumerian genes, and that's actually what the tumor is in the first place. I can't say. But since we're talking about Sumerian genes, there's also the introduction of the concept that humanity has been beaten down the Sumerians for years. And therefore, on top of everything else, the cherry on top is that there is some long storied history between humanity and the Sumerians that is most likely gonna be revealed next chapter, but we can't say. So while there's no big fight in this chapter, this is one of the most lore heavy chapters of JJK content I've ever interacted with. There's like 19 theory videos that can be made off this chapter alone, but there's a new chapter coming out in 7 days. But if Majulo does reveal that originally Sumerians lived on Earth and that humanity evolved from the Sumerians, which is why they have access to cursed energy, this manga will be a 10 out of 10. I have always been curious where cursed energy come from, so I want to know why it's only in Japan. And if Gege just uses Majulo as a way to answer lingering questions from JJK, it'll be the greatest thing he's ever done. But I'm curious to hear from you guys. What did you think of this chapter? Did you think it was incredible as I did? Let me know in the comments below. And while you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. Now, if you excuse me, I'm alone today. My girlfriend is at work, and there's 11 dogs that need attending to, and I would like to do at least some cardio today.